Hi, everyone. This is Kristen Wolf from Social Policy Research, and we're about to get started with the Remaking Apprenticeship for the Modern Workforce webinar today. We're so glad that you could join us. And if you haven't yet shared who you are and where you're calling in from, go ahead and do that in the chat box on the lower left. We're so glad you could make it, and we're super excited about today's webinar. So on the phone, we have me. I'm Kristen Wolf. I'm with Social Policy Research, and we've been long working with the Foundation for California Community Colleges on the CAI initiative, as many of you know. And then we also have Caleb Van Docto, who's helping out and will be kind of moving things along, and then Eduardo Ortiz, who's on the back end. It does take a village to manage these engagements. So thanks to the whole team for making that happen. So Brent is going to make a forceful case for apprenticeship as a mainstream education strategy for skill building, earning credentials that matter, and also for expanding opportunities to turn skills into meaningful careers and build diverse talent for growing companies and sectors. Having spent a year doing research on how to forge these connections, he's also come to understand that apprenticeship done right is about equity. So as I've said a few times now, and I'm not quite sure when I cut out, Brent is the Deputy Director on of the Center on Education and Skills with the Education Policy Program at the New America Foundation. And as you may know, they do a lot of work in this area. His work has focused on federal and state policies to help scale the kinds of programs we're going to talk about today. And prior to that, Brent was a Senior Policy Advisor at the U.S. Department of Labor, and even before that, led an effort to expand state-based support for work-based learning at the National Governors Association. He's authored numerous reports we've shared with you in the CAI project, and you can find him streaming live from New America when they host events on apprenticeship from their offices in Washington, D.C. We like to think of Brent as a thought leader who's also up for the challenge of doing the hard stuff, helping to put these programs together and turn them into the kind of system we need now to secure talent for tomorrow. So Brent, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for the kind introduction. And good morning, everyone out on the West Coast. It's exciting to be here with you all today, and really thank you to Kristen and Caleb and the whole team over at SPR for inviting me to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. Kristen did a great job of kind of framing what we're going to cover today, but we are going to talk about it at a high level and get down into the weeds around what it means to really integrate apprenticeship with our both secondary and post-secondary education systems, why that's an important thing to do, and what are some of the opportunities that exist today to get that done right. A quick word, I think Kristen again was helpful in sort of saying who I am, and what New America is, but so you know where I sit in New America. We are a nonpartisan think tank. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C. We do have offices in different parts of the country, though, including one in California. The Center on Education and Skills, where I'm the Deputy Director, we focus on a range of issues around how education connects to the labor market and how education promotes economic opportunity and mobility. So why are we here? Why are we talking about apprenticeship in particular? And I like to start by thinking through what really apprenticeship is. Over here on the left side of the screen, you'll see things that probably look quite familiar about what we're trying to do today to support our communities in terms of connecting folks to work and connecting employers to talent. We hear a lot about increasing the attainment of industry-valued credentials. We hear a lot of talk about increasing participation in work-based learning. We also hear a lot about how we can make our coursework at education, both in our high schools as well as in our colleges, more applied and more relevant to the real world. The problem is that in all of these things, there's really hard questions that come to us when we think about what does it mean to do them right? Which credentials and certifications are the most valuable in our labor market, and for our region, for our state, and the country? What's a quality work-based learning experience? Work-based learning can mean a lot of things, ranging from obviously an apprenticeship, but also internships, externships, and a number of other words and terminology that get tossed around, which is really folks spending time learning on the job. And then finally, increasing the applied coursework in our programs. How do we really know what's relevant to the real world? We're being asked these questions a lot, and the answer is often a common one. is that we should be engaging with industry. We should be talking to employers to get at what really are the answers to these really challenging questions. The issue is, though, that industry is being engaged sometimes midstream. What apprenticeship proposes is that we should partner and invest with industry on the front end to really inform program design, because it's the employers themselves that are actually responsible for delivering the bulk of learning. So apprenticeship is really something that brings together a lot of things that we see as familiar. It culminates in a credential. It's certainly high-quality work-based learning, and it has relevant applied learning. But it brings these pieces together and does it with industry on the front end to design a clear quality post-secondary option. Sounds easy so far, I'm sure. I'm smiling just in case you can't see me in webinar land. Of course, what are these programs? What is an apprenticeship? And I know there's a lot of discussion and there's a lot of things going on at the national level. There's a lot of folks who are bringing sort of what apprenticeship is to the conversation from a lot of different places. But we like to start here and say that really an apprenticeship has to have 4 essential corners. And what distinguishes it from other types of programs that are apprenticeship-like are 2 things. 1, each of these 4 corners, number 1, related to classroom-based instruction. Number 2, always paid on-the-job learning and mentorship. Number 3, assessment of the apprentice's skills against preset standards. And number 4, the attainment of the industry-recognized credential. We see these elements in a lot of different programs, but in an apprenticeship, they are all required. They're all part of one cohesive whole. The second thing that distinguishes apprenticeship from other what can be high-quality workforce development programs and initiatives is the role of industry. In many programs, industry is maybe responsible for informing curricula or hosting an internship. In apprenticeship, industry is intimately involved in all 4 of these things. Of course, when we say apprenticeship, we are referring to a number of different things, but when we talk about registered apprenticeship, that is really the only nationally accepted definition at this point from a legal standpoint of what an apprenticeship is. So I just wanted to say one word that really a registered apprenticeship has additional requirements and has additional processes associated with each one of these 4 corners. If we want to talk about that specifically, what those are, happy to do that as we get into the question and answer period. So I want to sum up here on this first point about what an apprenticeship is. Number 1, we have to understand apprentices are employees. There's a lot of eagerness today to think about apprenticeship as a high-quality post-secondary option, and there's a powerful case for it, and we're going to make that case. But we always have to remember that apprentices are first employees, but their employment is a contract. It's a term contingent contract with the employer that employment is about learning as well. They're in a contract that says we're going to do work, we're going to add value to the company, but the company or the sponsor, the employer's job is to help them learn and build skills for a career. The third thing is that we should understand that apprenticeship learning is authentic, and the idea is that this learning should be broadly valued and recognized. In fact, the point of an apprenticeship, why an apprenticeship has that classroom component, is to ensure that an apprentice's skills are not too narrow to the needs of any one employer, and that they have skills that are broadly valued by industry. The second part of this is we as education institutions and systems should be recognizing the valuable learning that happens in apprenticeship, not just what happens in the classroom, but the powerful competencies and skills that apprentices develop on the job. Why should we value it? Because the results of apprenticeship are pretty strong. Of course, it's limited in the United States today, and we'll talk about that. But what we do know is that when we look at apprenticeship programs, their completion rates actually stack up pretty well compared to traditional higher education programs. We know that naturally, given that apprenticeship is employment, that there's a tight connection to employment. But we also know that 91% of registered apprentices stay employed after the completion of the program. We also know that they perform pretty well in terms of the results in terms of wages. Completers on average of apprenticeship programs hit about $60,000 a year. And again, they have that added benefit of not having to take out any debt or loans on top of to be able to get to those wages. So all this sounds great, but what we have to appreciate and the challenge in front of us is that apprenticeship in the United States remains small. When we look at higher education today, where have undergraduate enrollments, nearly 20 million nationwide, we still today have only about, it's actually a little higher than 505,000 today. It's cresting closer to 510,000 registered apprentices in the country. Then we look at the really powerful drivers of our economy, the sectors that are really going to have a lot of growth and a lot of opportunities for folks. For example, healthcare, where over the next 10 years, you have 2.4 million possible job openings across the healthcare occupations. Yet today in the United States, there's only 1,852 registered apprentices in healthcare occupations. We could flip over, and there's a nice little zoom in on sort of what that proportion actually looks like. We could do the same exercise in information technology, where over the next 10 years, there's a range of different estimates, but 500,000 information technology openings. Yet today, as the latest data poll, there's just under 1,000 information technology apprentices that are been registered. So again, that zoom puts these things in perspective. Why is that? Why has apprenticeship not become the mainstream option to connect people to a range of occupations that are going to be driving our regional economies? The easiest thing to pin that on is, of course, the employers themselves. Again, apprentices are employees. You can't have more apprenticeships without employers willing to hire and sponsor apprentices. But there's some encouraging news coming out lately that employers are starting to see the value of alternative workforce development pipelines to their in-demand jobs. And one piece of research that I wanted to cite that's getting a lot of attention came out of the Harvard Business School at the end of the year from Professor Joe Fuller that did real-time analysis around sort of what the cost to employers relying on degrees and the issue around degree inflation, as opposed to what could be saved by investing in alternative strategies like apprenticeship. We could argue the value of that, but one thing we can't argue is demography, of course. And if we look at the aging American workforce, certain sectors, in particular advanced manufacturing, have tremendous motivations to be looking to invest in apprenticeship models and to do it younger. In some industry sectors, such as information technology, perhaps the demographic brain wave is not as big of an issue as really wanting to ensure their workforces are looking a lot more like the changing face of the United States. Many companies are starting to view apprenticeship possibly as a diversity strategy. All that's well and great, but what about on the public side? If the employers start these programs, the big question is sometimes, will people come? New America last year did some first of its kind national polling on apprenticeship to understand what people think of it. We did this as part of our broader higher education survey work, Varying Degrees, that we release each year. This is a nationally represented poll. And what we find here, that in that second column, apprenticeships actually perform pretty well as compared to more traditional higher education programs. They're right up there. People seem to be open to it. There's a couple caveats, though, that even though people seem to value apprenticeship as something that could help them connect to a good future and a good career, awareness still remained low about what they thought apprenticeship was. That's why, to complement the polling last year, we also did a set of focus groups. In particular, we focused on students. So we brought together high school students in 2 cities across the country, as well as parents. And we asked them about what they thought about apprenticeship as a pathway for them, not even just for some other kid, but for them. And the results were pretty startling in the sense that folks were tremendously open to the idea of pursuing an apprenticeship program should it become available, with some caveats. And the things I want to point to right here that's relevant to our discussion is around the importance of how people see apprenticeship as something that relates to college. So they like the idea that this could help address some of the college affordability issues that they're concerned about. At the same time, they were incredibly concerned about whether the learning they got out of these programs would be able to translate if they wanted to continue their education later. So the bottom line here at the bottom of this slide is so important, that for apprenticeship, and in particular apprenticeship to work for use in the United States, it will need to balance being distinct in something that seems like a valuable post-secondary option, but without looking like an alternative. So where does that stand us today? And this brings us to the third part of the presentation. We believe that to make apprenticeship opportunities more widely available, to capitalize on increased employer interest in apprenticeships, or at least incentives to start thinking about them, as well as the public's openness, we have to better connect apprenticeship to our education system. Let's talk about why. Over the past year, we put out 2 pieces of research that dig straight into those issues. On one hand, we looked at what it would mean to connect apprenticeship and higher education. As opposed to 2 systems that have coexisted for many years, what would it mean to actually bring them together, and why is that important? Particularly, going back to that slide around healthcare and information technology, if we want to expand apprenticeship into new industry sectors that, frankly, for generations have relied on bachelor's degree pathways in traditional higher education to fill key jobs, then apprenticeship to work has to be much more tightly integrated with higher education. Another report that we put out last year in December is called Youth Apprenticeship in America Today. It takes that a step further and says, what would it mean to actually connect these apprenticeship pathways that are much more tightly integrated with higher education to our high schools? The average age of an apprentice in the United States is 30. In other parts around the globe, which includes, of course, Germany and Switzerland, but even in the UK and Australia, where there's not as strong and old systems around apprenticeship, the average age of an apprentice is much closer to 17, 18, 19. So the United States is really an anomaly in that we see apprenticeship as something that's only for adults or for folks later in life. This report explores why, what the opportunities are to expand it, as well as what some promising state strategies are. I want to talk for a couple minutes about just a couple of the key things in these reports that might be relevant to our conversation here, and of course open to chat afterwards about these different questions. But the Connecting Apprenticeship and Higher Education report really tries to frame out one key need, the importance that we have to create a status. We have to make our apprentices less invisible in our higher education systems. Today, we can view the community colleges around the country, as well as technical colleges, play a strong role in actually a lot of apprenticeship programs. The report talks about how that role varies. But we don't see apprentices in our state higher education data systems. Institutions don't really know how to report on apprentices. Instead, these apprentices are really counted as either registered apprentices in the state registered system, and we don't know which of our registered apprentices are actually enrolled in earning credit and credentials from a accredited higher education institution. So the report says that we need to do a couple things. One, we need to create the definition of a student apprentice, as well as the definition of a special subgroup of apprenticeship programs called degree apprenticeships. We believe this is important on a couple fronts. One, if we really want to count, promote, and incent the expansion of apprenticeship, in particular by leveraging all of the different assets and resources that community colleges bring to that conversation, we need to find a way to create a business model for them to get involved. So we need to figure out how we count and incent apprenticeships that are happening in our community college system. That has to start with a definition. The second thing is we can use those definitions to target funding. You could look at state higher education funding, as well as pieces of federal legislation that are being examined today as possible for expanding apprenticeship. And finally, through this effort to create definitions around what it means to both be an apprentice and earning real transferable college credit, we can inform program design. On that particular issue of credit, I just want to spend just 1 minute here in saying that this is not a new concept per se that the report brought up, that apprentices should earn college credit. The traditional approach has been, and as was evidenced a couple of years ago by the launch of the Registered Apprenticeship College Consortia at the national level, is that for many years, higher education has given credit, usually for recognition of prior learning, for people that complete registered apprentices programs. In some cases, you also see institutions sequencing the coursework of the related instruction that they offer for apprenticeship programs to ensure that apprentices earn credit. That's, for example, what happens throughout the state of North Carolina, where their community college system is deeply involved with providing youth registered apprentices with associate degrees upon the completion of their programs, in addition to the apprenticeship credential. Finally, the deepest way, though, that this partnership can work in terms of credit is around how you work with consortia to actually design and deliver a competency-based program. So what does all that gobbledygook mean? It basically means, as opposed to just recognizing the learning that happens, through an apprenticeship, in particular, only the classroom-based, community and technical colleges are particularly well positioned to work with industry consortia or other partnerships promoting apprenticeship to actually design and deliver a program where all of the learning, whether it happens in the classroom or on the job, counts towards credit. Why is that important? It ensures that these programs are really a competency-based program and that the learning is completely connected between, again, what happens on the job and in the classroom. But the other part here is it ensures that programs aren't unnecessarily long. For example, some programs that do offer associate's degrees for their registered apprenticeship program may drag out to 4 or 5 years. That's not necessarily a bad thing on its face, but it also means that in some cases that there's not learning being counted for credit that happens even when the apprentice is working on the job, building competencies as is structured out in a registered apprenticeship program. Sounds easy, right? No, of course not. It's challenging, but we do have a couple of examples out there that I won't go into great detail about, but I wanted to fly through. We talk about them in our article. In Peoria, Illinois, in the cybersecurity sector, is the Community Initiative and Center of Excellence for Secure Software. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's an exciting program. It's a 2 or 3 year apprenticeship program for secure software development, among the first of its kind in the cybersecurity sector. Of course, the apprentice gets a certificate from DOL, but they also get an associate's degree from Illinois Central College, as well as additionally up to 3 additional certifications relevant to the cybersecurity sector. To build this program, there was an organization called ISHPE that came together, worked with educators on the front end to build out the competencies that this apprenticeship program needed to master and ensured that different levels of competency equivalent to different levels of credit throughout the 2 to 3 year process. One more example I want to flag is the Philadelphia Early Childhood Educator Career Pathways Partnership. This is, again, a 2 year apprenticeship program for early childhood educators in Philadelphia. Apprentices, again, get the certificate from DOL, the Journey Card. They get the associate's degree as well from the Community College of Philadelphia. And again, you see these certifications being embedded in the programs at different points in time to ensure not only are apprentices getting portable and stackable certifications, but they're getting certifications that they know can get them the job. In this case, of course, it's a required certification to become an early childhood educator in Philadelphia. Again, this isn't the community college just recognizing the program on the back end, or not just sort of transactionally offering the related instruction as part of a customized program. The community college was intimately involved with designing this program alongside employer partners such as SEIU to ensure that the apprentices got the credit they deserve for all aspects of learning. So again, how does all this come together? This is, again, challenging work that needs to have this mix of both systems level as well as practitioner level efforts. But of course, on one hand, engaging industry and professional associations as a consortia early on in the design of the programs to ensure they are competency-based seems to be a strategy that works. Doing this one employer at a time would be very challenging. The second thing is engaging the accreditor community. It's the elephant in the room. It's a big one. Our report talks through different opportunities and strategies for doing that, but it's a necessary step to ensure both the quality of the programs, but also that the community colleges aren't taking unnecessary risk as they try to provide, again, the apprentices the credit that they probably deserve. So we need to think about, in many respects, both at a state as well as a federal level, but also regionally, how do we sort of go from these more retail approaches to systems-based approaches so not everybody has to kind of reinvent the wheel. If we can do that, we believe we can make it easier to connect apprenticeship to our high schools. As I said, our focus groups made very clear. Parents and students are open to apprenticeship models if they're seen as a way to and through higher education. So we believe that we can envision youth apprenticeship as really an early college or dual enrollment program that brings together 3 key players: industry, high school, and post-secondary. People get very nervous sometimes when we talk about youth apprenticeship for high school students. But part of the interesting thing is people don't often associate it with what it is. Youth apprenticeship for a high school student is fundamentally a post-secondary program. We believe post-secondary institutions are best positioned and have the existing partnerships on one end with the employers in their region And on the other end, through existing dual enrollment articulation agreements with the high schools in their region. They really become the natural broker of these types of partnerships. And that was one of the key focuses of our other report that we put out, Youth Apprenticeship in America Today. Again, we explored several different issues around what it would mean to connect high school students to apprenticeship at scale. We believe that it's not a radical concept based on what we found from our research. We talk a lot about the public openness to youth apprenticeship as well as some of the caveats to that. But then we talk about the lack of scale. Again, you have a diverse national landscape of youth apprenticeship programs across the country. We provide somewhat of a typology of that. But we also talk about the history of efforts to expand youth apprenticeships in the United States, including going back to the school-to-work movement. Finally, we profile state strategies for scale. There are states today that are trying to expand youth apprenticeship in a meaningful way over a certain horizon. The 3 states that we do profile are worth mentioning. First is Wisconsin. Wisconsin has been investing in a statewide infrastructure, what we would call a system for youth apprenticeship, for over 20 years. It dates back to the school-to-work movement. The state administers much more of a grant program that supports these regional consortia across, again, employers, the state's technical colleges, as well as the K-12 institutions. In North Carolina, you see scale as well, but it's a little bit different approach. Here you have registered youth apprenticeship programs that are kind of exist as independent franchises of different employers across the state. But again, an interesting different origin story that dates back to a lot of the German and Swiss investment in North Carolina going back to the 1990s, but also shows that youth apprenticeship doesn't have to be a state program to be systemic. Finally, Colorado. CareerWise Colorado was founded by Governor John Hickenlooper, and a CEO in the state about 2 years ago. This has become a little bit of the darling of the youth apprenticeship world. It's an important startup effort where the state has built actually a statewide intermediary to broker partnerships between schools, employers, and colleges. So diverse strategies, but I want to finish here by saying they actually share some important things. Each one of these states that's been able to expand youth apprenticeship, or as well been able to look at how to better integrate apprenticeship with their higher education systems, is that they've built out a clear framework to guide quality, consistency, and scale. Why is that important? If you know what the goals of the system are, and we talked a little bit about those on the front end in terms of enhancing equity, but also ensuring that employers across a range of industries are able to access the talent they need to compete, then if you know the goals, you can set the framework for quality, and then whatever is a quality program, you can drive resources to it. This sounds maybe obvious in a world where we have a registered apprenticeship system. However, we must point out that the registered system on itself can't dictate the type of systemic relationships that need to exist in order to really mainstream apprenticeship with higher education. Registered registration is an important quality assurance mechanism and one we believe strongly in. But we also believe there's that extra step that can be taken to make it easier and enable more higher education institutions to get engaged. Second, we really need to give attention to the policy and systems change to enable and recognize the learning that we've been talking about across this webinar so far. We need to, of course, build out industry-wide approaches. We can't ask colleges, just like we can't ask individual employers, to start from scratch and set up programs. How do we tap into existing consortia as well as existing pathways to build out programs where not every individual institution or employer has to reinvent the wheel? We also have to look at policy and financing, and that's a no-brainer to folks on this call, I know. But really, we have to figure out what the business model is going to be to support the learning that needs to be that happens in an apprenticeship and also gets recognized. The most important thing that we also want to say around financing is that there's a lot of talk around how do we use our money to incent more employers to set up programs. Something that we've said very clearly throughout both of our reports is that if apprenticeships are leading to actual degree pathways, there's a very strong case to support the related instruction aspect of an apprenticeship. It's amongst the biggest costs of an apprenticeship program for an employer outside of the wages. If we can use either grant funding in our existing workforce or higher education streams to help subsidize the cost of some of the related instruction for employers, the state or whoever is involved at the regional level has a compelling interest to ensure that that learning is going to happen be portable and that folks can build on it over time. We believe sure tax credits are nice, but really the most powerful for incentives for employers is actually the best thing for apprentices, to make sure that you're supporting high quality learning that complements the learning on the job. The other piece of this, where there's been a lot of discussion around roles for public investment, is the sustainable financing model for an intermediary capacity. We can't get apprenticeship done if it's not someone's day job. And so we have to think about, in addition to sort of a lot of the existing federal grants that have been powerful incentives for sort of identifying who can be an intermediary and working with employers to set up apprenticeship programs, we have to think on what scale in both industry as well as the government wants to subsidize and keep that capacity going. Finally is the biggest design lift as well. Who's in the position to coordinate these partnerships across the various players that be involved in an apprenticeship program is a big question for any state or region to figure out. But we want to make very clear that there's no one answer to that, and we really do believe that community and technical colleges can play an important role in this space. So to finish up here, we identified several areas about what it would mean to move toward an apprenticeship pathway system. Both reports explore specific things that we believe are kind of cross-cutting issues that need to be identified, whether that's a regional partnership or a state partnership that's looking at building a true apprenticeship pathway system in these new industry sectors. Definitions and data, pathway program design, financing, and of course the support and capacity building for the partnerships to get this done. This should look familiar, and part of the reason why is that where we see a lot of apprenticeship has historically been the mode of developing our workforce in the trades. They have these things figured out. There's an infrastructure, there's an idea of what an apprenticeship is, and there's resources to support it. The trades figured out apprenticeship a long time ago. That same type of infrastructure, that same type of system, if we want apprenticeship to exist in other industries, has to be conceived of and supported. Finally, a word of just slight motivation. This is all very challenging work, and I commend everyone out there for all the work they're doing on the ground and for joining us to talk a little bit about what apprenticeship could be and also the case for it to be much more seen as a much more mainstream education strategy. But we have been here before, and the United States has been in this place. So what I leave you with is this was a quote that was actually pulled from some research at the dawn of 1918, so 100 years ago, when the United States was in a very similar, you could describe the situation similarly, where you have more people trying to get onto the first rung of the middle class, new industry sectors are emerging, established ones are having a hard time finding their jobs. All these things were as true then as they were today. All these led to eventually what was the gradual making the United States into the first nation to offer universal secondary education. That's right, the rise of the high school started 100 years ago. Let's not hope it's going to take 100 years to create high quality workforce pathways for all folks to connect to opportunity, but we have done it before, and it's exciting to hear from all of you that are doing the work on the ground to get us there. So thank you. Chris and I am happy to open up to questions or however we want to proceed from here.
I might be having trouble with my sound again. Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. That was a fire hose of information and wonderful. And for people on the phone, we'll be sure and get the reports that were cited all the way through to you. I think we've probably sent them to you before, but I know that too can feel like a fire hose. So we'll be sure and get them to you. Brent, we have a lot of community colleges on the phone, and so I wondered if you could say a little bit more. You know, many of them have started under CAI with programs sort of at the program level, either brand new or building on smaller programs that are tied to an employer or a sector. And I wondered if you could speak to how colleges in some of the other states have played a role in scaling apprenticeship, whether on the youth side or the adult side. You know, just what does that role look like? How have they been instrumental in scaling in some of the states that you cited?
Sure. Great question. And I'd love to hear from folks about some of the work they're doing at some point in this space. So I'll start with the obvious one that I think a lot of folks probably hear. If you've been in sort of this apprenticeship space or putting your toe in, I'm sure you hear a lot about the South Carolina story. I hold that up because it actually tells one possible way that technical and community colleges play such an important role. In South Carolina, of course, within about 10 years, they grew apprenticeships 700%. That's a big number, but to get a big number like that, you're obviously starting from a very small one. But the point is, it's been a state that's really seen as kind of what's been successful at growing apprenticeship on a systemic scale. And they did it through the technical college system. What did they do exactly? They actually created full-time employment positions in each of their technical colleges across the state to really be a part of this broader statewide system called Apprenticeship Carolina. But these were folks that were based in the technical colleges whose full-time job was to go out and work with employers and help them set up apprenticeship programs. Why was it important to have them in the technical college? Because the technical colleges were already the ones that were doing a lot of the workforce and economic development for the regions. Apprenticeship just made sense to embed them there. It also meant that the technical and community college was that ready-to-go asset for employers once they wanted to get on board with apprenticeship programs. All the programs in South Carolina are federally registered programs, but all of the related instruction that happens in those programs happens at the state's technical college system. So on one hand, technical colleges can really be seen as powerful intermediaries for really ensuring that there's a whole range of solutions that exist for employers in their communities. The second piece that we've seen where community colleges played an important role is something I mentioned briefly, but I want to hit on again. In other states, just Wisconsin is one of the ones we profiled, as well as Colorado. Our community colleges are really a unique institution in our country in that they have these relationships both with employers on one side of the house, as well as with our high schools on the other side of the house. With the rise of dual enrollment in early college programs, community colleges are the best positioned to help broker the relationships that need to exist to make youth apprenticeship partnerships work. And the most important thing is that it can actually be beneficial for them in that they have these assets and programs already going. We've seen in the states that have been able to get youth apprenticeship programs off the ground by putting the colleges at the center and saying you have these relationships, you're the ones that are able to really kind of broker a pathway that is permeable and a pathway that's high quality. You can move the dial. So that the stories in Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Colorado hold up that critical role of community college. I think Kristen's having trouble with her microphone again, but I won't subject you to keep rambling off other states that are doing some things, but I'll pause here and let her try to get back on.
Can you hear me now?
Now we got it.
Okay, I'm not sure what's going on, but anyway, it just takes me a few times each time. Anyway, that was so great, and thanks. And it's also a nice segue to a next question, which is on this issue of credit. It's one of the thornier issues, as you know, and mentioned throughout your presentation. But I wondered, often apprenticeship can start on the workforce side of the house, the non-credit side of the house, and I wondered if you could help us understand how the transition to credit has occurred in some of the cases that you cited, either at the college level or with the help of a state. But if you do start on that side, how do you make your way to credit-bearing apprenticeships?
Yeah, great question. So you kind of get funny looks when you go around and tell, there's this great idea that, community and technical colleges should, play a stronger role and can really be the feature role of expanding apprenticeship in the United States. You get a funny look because they've been playing a role in apprenticeship for a very long time. Historically, outside of the trade unions that actually offer their own related instruction in their own training institutions, community and technical colleges have been the go-to provider for a lot of registered programs. As you mentioned, Kristen, though, a lot of that has been treated as sort of customized training on the workforce side of the house, or the non-credit side. The reason is that apprenticeship is really fully funded by the employer. the employer really has to customize the program to meet their needs. It just made sense to put it over there. What's changed are two things about apprenticeship that we think has made the case for bringing that over to the other side of the house. One, as apprenticeship expands to different industry sectors, we mentioned cybersecurity and healthcare and early childhood education, but another great example that's from around the country is what's going on in Chicago right now, where apprenticeship is actually expanding fairly rapidly into the financial services and insurance sector. This has been an exciting development, but what all of these industries have in common is that to get those jobs traditionally, and most importantly to move up in those jobs, people really need an actual associate's or a bachelor's degree. So as apprenticeship moves into industries, in particular, more employers in different industries that are much more traditionally aligned with building out programs that have true degrees involved with them, it's forcing us to really adapt and think about the importance of apprenticeship programs in those new industries to exist on the credit side of the house, as opposed to treating it as a super customized, narrow approach. The other piece of that, of course, is around that narrowness. We treat things as customized and narrow because they're often very transactional. And if employers, one employer at a time, is approaching a community college, asking them to set up a program, you can't really do the hard work that it involves around working with the accreditors and thinking about financing to move that onto the credit side of the house. And probably that one individual employer maybe doesn't need that. But if you start seeing more of these sector-based or consortia approaches come together, now we have a little bit of scale, we have sustainability, that case, that upfront design we can actually do because we know that these programs are going to have a constant pipeline of folks, not onesies and twosies, because many employers are coming together and drawing from the well. So the two things in apprenticeship, both its expansion into more degree-familiar industry sectors, as well as the rise of more consortium, multi-employer, or sector-based apprenticeship programs, is making it both more compelling and also just making a better case and easier for higher ed institutions to think about doing apprenticeship on the credit versus the customized side of the house.
Thanks, Brent. And we have another question, too, on a related note. Can you cite a couple of practical examples of credit-bearing education that starts in high school and then provides a transfer to community college or dual enrollment and then into apprenticeship tracks? Where is that going on, and in what sectors and industries?
Sure. So I'll make one amendment to that because I can't say that there's an example of that necessarily. It's actually what you have is the apprenticeship track starts while they're still in high school. And through the apprenticeship program, they're actually dual enrolled, both in high school as well as a higher education institution as part of the apprenticeship program. So it's not a pipeline into the apprenticeship program. It's actually the apprenticeship itself is the dual enrollment program with a community college as a partner in it. So where is that happening? In the state of Colorado, with CareerWise, they've developed 4 industry pathways: information technology, advanced manufacturing, financial and professional services, and now healthcare, where they are dual enrolling high school juniors and seniors at the local or relevant community or technical college. At the same time they're taking that coursework, they're spending progressively over the course of that 3-year program more time working on the job. So the youth apprenticeship itself in Colorado is actually the dual enrollment program of which the community college is the partner. Very similar programs exist throughout the state of North Carolina. In particular, Apprenticeship 2000, which has been around since the 90s, is a program that was started by a consortia of advanced manufacturers outside the Charlotte region. Now there's many more consortia around the state that do the same thing, but those programs, again, function the same way. In Apprenticeship 2000, you start as a high school junior or senior. It's a 4-year program. For the first 2 years, you're, of course, taking your high school coursework. You're also taking coursework, dual enrollment coursework at Central Piedmont Community College. And you're also spending time mostly in the summer, but also some days after school, working for one of the local employers that participates in the program. It's another exciting dual enrollment model that exists. Other states have these as well. There's examples of them throughout the country. The report points out some of those specific ones and goes into a little bit more detail about how they work. But the two states that have really achieved a level of scale with this, or pushing towards scale, are both Colorado as well as North Carolina. And again, these are youth apprenticeship programs, but they function as early college dual enrollment programs. And the coursework is being delivered by the community college. The student is quite impressively spending time across multiple different types of learning experiences, but they get a lot out of it.
Thanks. That was a great answer and a great question. So thanks for submitting that question on chat. For everyone else on the phone, feel free to contribute questions. I'd like to take it in a slightly different direction now, at the risk of having the folks on the phone kind of roll their eyes because we talk about employer engagement so much. It is such an important part of apprenticeship. And one of the struggles in particular, picking up on a point that you mentioned earlier in your presentation, is that so many colleges and so many programs have good relationships with employers or employer associations, but they tend to be kind of advisory in nature. And then once you shift to engagement around apprenticeship, obviously it's a much more intense relationship, and the work is actually different. And so that shift can be a little jarring sometimes on both parties. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how colleges are making that shift and what that looks like. And then maybe as a complement, we often talk about sort of that engagement activity. You know, is it marketing? Is it outreach? Is it making the case for apprenticeship? Sort of, you know, what is it? And can you talk a little bit about sort of successful ways of engaging and making the case for apprenticeship inside of those relationships?
Yes, so that's a exciting range of questions on this front, and it's really it's the essence of what's most critical. On one hand, it's this question of, you know, we hear it, it's exhaustive, like engage employers, engage employers. Apprenticeship is really asking for this next layer down, which is really working and getting employers to actually invest. That's something that you can't do with a magic wand. But where we've seen community colleges been successful is that they're looking at what they're already doing in their region with many employers that they have established relationships with. They're able to look at, for example, what types of customized training are they doing, and they have relationships there. They look at the different credentials in their region that they might be offering, certificates and whatnot, and they really build sort of from the in out. And they're looking at sort of existing relationships they have, and then how do they start deepening them through an apprenticeship. Again, it's a challenge, I think, for all of us who are coming from maybe more of a practitioner or policy perspective to be thinking about this, because you can't force employers to just say, we want to do this apprenticeship program. But where there's been success, it's actually somewhat counterintuitive is what we're finding. And I'd be interested if other folks are having this experience. We're told to engage employers a lot, and sometimes we confuse that with the need to overly customize solutions for employers and say, we're engaging with you, tell us exactly like what you want to build and we'll build it from scratch. The places that have been more successful at scaling youth apprenticeship have actually thought like a business in a little bit of a different way. Businesses are used to buying products. Businesses are used to having sort of these transactional relationships. If you have a pre-baked apprenticeship program, if you have the idea of what the sort of baseline of what you want your programs to look like, you offer them in a select number of, for example, occupational fields, then you're offering a product to the employer as opposed to sort of the opportunity to co-design a solution. All the co-design and all the engagement work is something that still needs to happen, but we would argue keep that at a more strategic level. Talking about workforce issues, talking about sort of demographic issues, talking about what are the jobs that you're going to need to fill in the next 5 years. Those are important engagement, strategic discussions that you have to do apprenticeship. But when it comes to talking about actual apprenticeship programs, think about it as what can you pre-bake and have a pre-baked solution to give employers something to opt into. And we found that from a lot of our work from around the different states that have tried to develop statewide strategies for apprenticeship, where they're saying, you know, we'll work with you to customize elements of the program, but here's the program. And again, that it's not going to be for every employer. That's something we all have to appreciate. But if you come to it by saying, here's the program, now we're going to make it easy for you to opt in and and build this program. You don't have to do it from scratch. We don't have to meet 15 times before you necessarily get it up and running. That's something that seems to work. And so making that super practical in two of the states that we looked at, those are the Carolinas that again have been fairly successful on this front, they actually have these apprenticeship consultants at their colleges that carry around laptops. And in those laptops are standards of pre-baked programs in high-demand industries that they've built with other employers in their state, or things that these templates that they've already said. And so when they sit down with an employer, they sit across the table, they don't say, hey, let's work together to design an apprenticeship program. They open the laptop. And in the laptop is the general framework, and they use that to have a conversation with the actual employer. So the big takeaway there is we all know we need to make it easier to lower the transaction cost to get employers engaged with apprenticeship. But it's counterintuitive in some ways, and it's places that have seemed to have some success aren't the ones that are sort of overly customizing and building things with an individual employer from scratch. It's ones that have kind of a preset framework or solution and that are really kind of selling a product versus sort of selling a partnership at first.
Wow, that was such a practical and great example. Thanks for answering the question in that really tangible way. It also occurs to me, and I'll give everybody one more shot at submitting questions. We have about 5 minutes left. So if you have a question that you're dying to ask, now would be the time to submit it. Go ahead and use the chat box on the lower left. But Brent, I also just wanted to sort of connect the dots here. It also strikes me that the approach that you're talking about, sort of a prepackaged product, also seems like it might make the conversation about credit easier, because then it's not a constant going back and forth and making sure each individual program can have credit tied to it, but rather you can make the decision about the more generic product and then tweak the details on the other end. Are you finding that to be true, or is that just a hypothesis and error?
Absolutely, and that's definitely the other side of it. Again, it's equally as challenging for talking about how we engage an employer and trying to set up standards to offer the work-based learning aspect of the apprenticeship program, as when you think about what it takes for a higher education program a higher education institution to really figure out how this program fits in within the broader credit side of the house. If we, again, though, have these negotiated frameworks, if there's a state policy on the books, if there's an agreement across sort of a consortia, that really makes that background work easier. And then once you have the first 2, 3 done, the next 5 of them get a lot easier, a lot quicker. That's kind of been a universal lesson across the apprenticeship field, is that the first ones are always challenging to set up. And that's true for the employer as well as if you want to make this credit bearing in some way. But if you do the homework, you do the framework, there's a process in place, both internal within the higher education institution, as well as a process for employers to enter into these partnerships, the next 5 of them become a lot easier. That's no doubt why it's so important to be thinking about apprenticeship programs in particular as part of a system. And what we mean by that is, what are really the places where you see the opportunity for apprenticeship programs? You have to understand it can't be for everyone and it can't be for everything, but it can be for more. And so where are the areas? If that's healthcare, if that's cybersecurity, if that's both of them, if that's transportation logistics, what are the industry sectors that you really see apprenticeship being able to work for? Build the frameworks out there. Don't try to boil all the ocean at once, but build the high quality frameworks that ensures that students get what they need as apprentices, and importantly, that the employers are getting something for the investment that they're making.
Well, thank you so much. This has been so great and sort of a really good dose of inspiration on a Friday. So thanks everyone for joining, and a special thanks to Brent. We just so appreciate you being able to participate. and look forward to much more soon. And for everyone else, we'll of course go ahead and send out the recording and the slides along with the documents that were referenced throughout the presentation. And we look forward to talking with you again very soon. Thanks so much.